You're listening to the I Love You Keep Going podcast with George Haas. For more information, please visit our website at www.mettagroup.org. That's www.mettagroup.org.
So welcome everybody. This is I Love You Keep Going. It is Thursday, December 12th at 7:40 p.m. Pacific time, 2024. And I thought tonight that I would talk about how you develop a dismissing attachment strategy and take a look at that. We often talk about the development of emotional regulation as this series of things that happen starting in early childhood. We're born. We're largely autoregulators. Our brainstem is intact. Our right brain is partially formed. Our left brain is not that well developed. And so, in the beginning, the first few months or so, we are really sort of in this experience of ourselves without much capacity to discern or distinguish the environment too well. And so in that stage, we're all autoregulators. We regulate ourselves independent of a sense of the world around us. And then as we develop, say 3 to 5 months in there, somewhere in that range, we begin to reorient toward people that come to take care of us if they come reliably enough that it makes sense for us to move out of the auto-regulating into the external regulator. And then the external regulator takes care of us. And if they take care of us consistently enough, that we don't worry about whether we can receive care from them, we begin to move into a collaborative experience of emotional regulation. The infant presents themselves in a completely authentic manner. The caregiver sensitively attunes, understands what the child is trying to communicate, and then provides the care that the child is requesting. And if the caregiver and the child can attune and sync up without a lot of misattunement, the child demonstrates what it is that they need. The caregiver learns what that expression is like and responds. And so the caregiver and infant enter into this collaborative exchange of the requesting for care and then the responsiveness of the caregiver. As the caregiver provides the care consistently, the child learns what it is that is regulating for them, and then they begin to develop the capacity to do that for themselves. When you have a whole series of these capacities to regulate yourself in different kinds of circumstances, the child begins to take on a self-mastery in terms of regulating themselves. The reason that this is important is because that capacity to regulate yourself independent of the caregiver is the in some sense the space in which you can begin to develop your skills as an explorer of the world and a seeker of meaning. You can go out into the world, you can discover the things that you need to know. If something happens and you get emotionally dysregulated, you have a reliable source of emotional regulating in your caregiver, and you can come rushing back to them, and you don't worry about whether you'll have access to them or that they'll be able to help you or not, because they've demonstrated over and over again their reliability. But if that doesn't happen, you have a caregiver who comes enough that you reorient into an external relationship with them for emotional regulation, but they're not reliable enough that you don't worry about whether they'll be available to you and whether they can help you, then you become oriented toward them. This is the origin of the preoccupied mind, that you're constantly having to track the location of the caregiver so that you can, and constantly having to seek proximity with the caregiver in order to be able to emotionally regulate. But if nobody comes reliably enough, that you reorient toward an external source of emotional regulation, you stay in that auto-regulating position. And that's really the origin of the dismissing attachment strategy in adults, a profound neglect uh, for the child's needs. Now, that doesn't mean that the child is uncared for necessarily. Sometimes in rigid forms of parenting, the child is put on a schedule or things are provided for the child. But what's missing in that equation is the actual needs of the child. And the child is then put into a position of having to adapt to the care that they're receiving rather than the care being oriented around what they might need. Neglect, of course, could also mean that a child is not cared for particularly well. But in order for a child to survive, you need to have basic sustenance, but you don't need to have the nurturing aspect of that. The other thing that happens to children that are profoundly neglected or put into these binds where really they have to perform for the caregivers, they learn a process of idealization. So idealization is a process of amplifying the appearance of goodness. Often the terms of that are prescribed by the caregiver, what they think is useful, what they think is good. The child learns to perform in that way. And at the same time, it's an absence of anything negative. That's what the idealizing equation is. The child presents an ideal view, an ideal version of reality, and the caregivers reward them for that. And if they don't present an idealized view, they're not rewarded. Usually that is accompanied by withdrawal of affection. So here is a child that has to suppress their attachment needs, suppress their emotional needs, and put themselves in a place where they can perform an idealized version of the experience that the caregiver wants to have. And in order to do that, um, the attachment system is suppressed and the emotional system is suppressed. And if they do that, of course, then they get their needs met. So what you'll notice in people who grow up to be dismissing, they're quite transactional in the way that they conduct relationships. It's not collaborative in the sense that where in a collaborative relationship you would take on the whole care of a person. In the dismissing thing, it's quite transactional. You do this for me, I'll do that for you. You do this for me, I'll do that for you. Actually, it's probably better if you get into a relationship with a dismissing person, when you understand what the transaction is going to be, you get the payment first. Because if you do that for them and they don't have to provide for you, they tend to not do it because it keeps the resources that they need to transact for later care. Now, we sometimes think with dismissing adults that it's a volitional, right? That they understand how a collaborative relationship might work, and they just simply tune that out and decide instead to do a transactional-based relationship. But actually, they never really had the experience of somebody coming and attending to them without them having to present this idealized view. And so they don't think of it that way. They think what I have to do is learn from you what it is that you need me to present to you so that I can present it to you so that you'll give me what I want. And remember, it's an idealized version. So if they think that you want the sun, the stars, and the moon, they will promise the delivery of the sun, the star, and the stars and the moon. And as soon as you accept that and provide for them what they want, in their mind, the transaction is complete. You might think, well, I'm going to get the sun, the stars, and the moon, but it's never delivered. And you then might have some contest about that. But to the mind of the dismissing person, you wanted an idealized version. I gave you the idealized version, and you gave me what I wanted. And so the transaction is complete. In some sense, in the adult version of this, dismissing people most commonly form relationships with preoccupied people. And you may remember in the descriptions of preoccupied people pretend to have a problem. They tend to pretend to be helpless so that you can solve a problem for them, which works really well with an idealizer because you pretend to have a problem which isn't really a real problem. They pretend to solve the problem, which isn't really a solution. But it's not a problem in the dynamics of the relationship because the problem that you needed solved in the first place wasn't a real problem. And so the dynamic in that relationship is really the pretend problem, the pretend solution. When you're talking about children or infants, at 10 months old, we can test a child in the strange situation and understand what their attachment strategy is. And 70% of people will use the attachment strategy that they have at 10 months old for their entire lives. So attachment conditioning it happens early and it's very stable. So a child who is neglected, their needs, the needs of the individual, those authentic experiences that they need, are profoundly neglected, and instead they're put in a situation where they have to provide an idealized version of what the reality of that experience is in order to get the care that they want. Suppressing the attachment system means that the exploration system is left on. In a secure dynamic, of course, you're out exploring. Then if something dysregulates you, the attachment system turns on, which deactivates the exploration system so that you can come back to the people that will help you regulate. But because dismissing people suppress the attachment system, their exploration system remains on. So they tend to be able to explore pretty well. We might talk about primary and secondary exploration in this way because dismissing people use a transactional basis for acquiring the needs that they have. They're oriented around gathering the time, energy, and resources, often the social position or the power position that will allow them to be able to negotiate and transact the care that they need. So that their exploration is really oriented around a secondary exploration, the gathering of time, energy, and resources. And they have the same difficulty of a truncated primary exploration that preoccupied people and disorganized people have. They don't see the value of it enough to pursue it because they also suppress the conscious experience of emotion. They have a hard time understanding what it is that really is a source of meaning for them and really are much more focused on social status and power and resources in order to transact for the care that they want. Because you suppress awareness of your emotions consciously does not mean you don't have the emotions and does not mean the emotions aren't informing the decision-making process. You just don't have the conscious information that that's what's happening. And so you often don't have the breaks that you might need to have in order not to cause suffering in the people around you. When we talk about empathy, we talk about it in a number of levels. The first level is this visceral response to the witnessing of somebody's physical or emotional pain. Uh, we talk about being able to read facial expressions and body language and interpret the emotional meaning of that. The third is the empathetic experience uh, or the empathetic experience of compassion, where you feel in your body the emotional state of someone else. And we really do use the comparison between the second and the third level of empathy to understand whether somebody is telling us the truth or not. If the second level, the external presentation of facial expressions and body language matches the felt sense of the person, then we tend to think that they're telling us the truth. Secure people also have a fourth aspect that they pay attention to, which is whether you do what you say you're going to do and whether you don't do what you say you're not going to do. But dismissing people, preoccupied people, disorganized people don't really track that, because in the childhood experiences they had, the caregivers never really did what they said they were going to do in order to reduce the pain of that. Most people in childhood split that off, and so they don't really monitor whether somebody does what they say they're going to do. They rely more on the explanations that people provide, the narratives that people provide. Dismissing people because they shut down the embodied sense of emotion are really blind in terms of being able to determine whether or not somebody is telling the truth in that way. In fact, it's hard for them to understand what's going on with another person without it being offered to them in words. And depending on how profound the neglect was and how early it happened, many dismissing people are unable to read facial expressions and body language to understand what representation the person that they're dealing with is making. Uh, how do we understand facial expressions and body language? We learn it from the experience of the caregiver empathetically attuning to us. So we're an infant, we're making an expression, the caregiver sensitively attunes, empathetically connects to us, and then they mirror back to us in their facial expressions the experience that they're understanding we're having. And so we begin very early to associate the body sensations that we have with the facial expressions of the caregiver that they're reflecting to us. And they're probably narrating the experience, or which is to say, oh, you seem sad. Oh, you seem happy. You seem frightened. You seem glad, whatever it is the experience is having. But kids that are profoundly neglected actually don't have that experience of the caregivers narrating. They don't have the experience of the caregivers reflecting back to them what their experience is and tying it to the sensations in the body so that they can learn to map that second aspect of empathy. And depending on the degree of the shutdown and the degree of the neglect, some dismissing people are completely blind in terms of recognizing the subtle facial expressions and body language that people offer as part of communication. And they rely strictly on the narrative, on the words. And they're actually fairly easily manipulated because they don't have any way of validating what people say. Christian.
George, I wonder if, like, in the sense that dismissing people have maybe certain deficits around recognizing emotions, but can have like can be in touch with maybe anger and certain emotions. Um, do they, despite maybe having not a great attunement to the emotions in others, there are certain emotions like anger, perhaps, that they are pretty good at recognizing?
Um, you often have the experience of a dismissing person yelling at you in a very angry manner. And when you say something like, "Why are you so angry?" they just as often would say, "I'm not angry." So it really depends on how complete the suppression is
Okay.
consciously. Now, some charismatic and capable manipulators that are dismissing actually have a highly developed second level. They can read facial expressions and body language. But most of the time, the method that they use is to elicit from you without you really noticing the things that you would like, so that then they can wrap it up in an idealized version and feed it back to you. I remember I was dating somebody in the 80s, and I just kept having the experience of over and over again him saying to me the things that I had been longing my entire life to hear somebody say to me, right? It was just absolutely intoxicating. One of the great love bombers of my life. But my roommate said, what are you talking about? A half an hour ago, he was asking you all these questions about all this stuff. He just fed it back to you. And I had done it so skillfully, I hadn't noticed that he was eliciting from me the things that I had wanted to hear. So he was quite skilled at that. But he didn't, when I confronted him about it, he didn't have a problem with it. He said, "Yes, of course I did it. That's what you're supposed to do, right? That's how the world works. I elicit from you the things that you want. I buff them up and shine them up, and I present them in this golden fashion, and you feel fantastic. And then you give me what I want, and that's a complete uh, exchange." And no, there was no follow through on any of it, but there was never the intention for the follow through because they didn't think follow through was part of the bargain because it wasn't in uh, the family system that they grew up in. In the family system, they grew up and they do the idealizing thing and they get the reward, and that's complete. And when you're in that kind of family system, nobody, I guess, is really expecting there to be delivery of what you actually say is going to be delivered because it's never delivered. But it's when you have the expectation that actually they're going to do something, they're going to do what they say they're going to do, you have a problem with it. But of course, if you're not monitoring whether somebody does what they say they're going to do, it takes a long time to figure out that they're not actually delivering on it. That making sense.
I had I had something happen like 10 or so years ago. I was at a bar with friends and friends of friends, and a friend of a friend knew that I played violin, but had never heard me play. And he turned to someone else that we were just meeting for the first time, and he's like, Christian is like one of the best violinists he's like a great violinist. And I was totally turned off by that, but it didn't work. It didn't work that time, but I was like, okay. When you were saying that, it made me think of that story. I was like, okay.
So you have an expectation that there's a little more reality in the narrative.
Maybe I could be seduced, but that one was just too blatant. Not unseducible.
Well, let's just chalk it up to the lack of skill in the dismissing person not eliciting what it was that he needed to feed to you and just assuming what it was.
Right.
The for a lot of us, when you encounter somebody who's dismissing and good at being dismissing and and good at idealizing, it's quite shocking when there's no delivery, and we often can get into a mind state of it's volitional, that they know that they're misrepresenting, they know they're lying, they didn't intend to deliver. But it really is important, I think, to understand that delivery is not part of idealizing. Idealizing is the presentation. They present idealized view, and you have the emotional experience of it, which is very intoxicating, and that's their contract completed, and then you're supposed to provide for them the thing that they're going for. So that if you're not willing to be in a relationship where it really is this sort of suspended from reality exchange, it's disconcerting. Uh, so that's why these patterns of relationship begin to form, dismissing people with preoccupied people. I pretend to have a problem, you pretend to solve it. And so there's no real friction in that exchange. While you're pretending to solve it, I get the proximity I like. And I get from you that elevation, that juice of what a commanding, capable person I am. And the reason that dynamic is important is because at the core of the dismissing person is the terrible sadness of a childhood where nothing they offered of their authentic experience was ever acceptable or valued. Nothing they tried, nothing that they could do could get the caregivers to respond to their authentic needs. And so those needs were never met. Uh, and that the so those attachment needs arising over and over again and being presented to the caregivers are often simply either never attended to, which is the neglect aspect, or they're actively rejected. So you also notice in dismissing people is an extreme sensitivity to rejection. This is actually abandonment fear, but they don't experience it as abandonment fear. They experience it as rejection. And so, what you may, Christian, as you were describing the anger that is often expressed by dismissing people, um, rather than being genuine anger, is again a strategy for getting the thing that they want. And you'll notice that there's a pattern of seduction and bullying, I like to call it, but idealizing and derogating is very common in dismissing people. They try to seduce you with the idealizing, and if that doesn't work, then they come at you with the derogating anger. Christian?
So I'm curious if there's kind of I don't dismissing people get really dunked on in the sort of attachment discourse, but I'm curious if um they don't do this with secure people. They kind of figure out who this would work on, the kind of idealization or the derogation, um, or if they just are like are willing to kind of turn off secure people that are tracking this more carefully.
I don't, you're again thinking that it's volitional, and it's not. They don't have the skill set for secure functioning relationships, and secure people will not accept a one-sided exchange. And so they don't really relate too well with secure people.
I guess I mean I don't mean it to be volitional, but in the sense that we're always getting cues from the outside world and making small adjustments, and maybe that's a sort of unconscious or subconscious process. Um,
They're
are they
really not good at picking up cues.
okay? So it's kind of throw stuff out and just whatever sticks, they proceed in that direction. And that's usually with insecurely attached people.
Well, dismissing people are insecurely attached. So uh, they don't they're not empathetically attuned to people. They have the capacity to, uh, sometimes they have the capacity for the second level of empathy. They read people pretty well, but most of the time they're soliciting it in language. They're very cognitively oriented. They're very language oriented. They want you to tell them what it is that they need to know about you so that they can push it out in an idealized form. And the ones that are really capable at that are really good at eliciting the material that they need from you without you really noticing it and then feeding it back to you in a way that's intoxicating. Um, they never deliver on it on what they provide, but what they are providing is the intoxication, and that's that idealized intoxication. The colloquial term for it in our culture is love bombing. I don't know if you've heard that before, but that's what really that mechanism is. And in that state of intoxication, you tend to be generous in giving them what they want, which is this inflation, right? And the reason they want to be inflated is at the core of their authentic experience is the terrible sadness that nothing they've ever been able to do could get anyone to be interested in them, to see them, to value them, to take care of them. They've always had to pump up this false sense of self in order to get the care that they needed, but it's always been transactional. It's never been freely offered to them. And because they don't have the experience of that delight even, they don't have the experience of delight in the secure sense of that, where you simply delight in the beingness of somebody. It's always been transactional. They have had to produce this idealized version in order to get a response. But it's a response to the idealization, not a delight that comes freely, that's freely offered. Um, most of the time we learn the relationship to the terrible sadness, and each of the different attachment strategies has a terrible sadness, but the elements of the terrible sadness are different. The terrible sadness in the preoccupied person is really around the abandonment of self in order to pretend to be what somebody else wants, and the abandonment of self. In the dismissing person, it's different in the sense that at the core of it is this belief that you're incapable of getting people to take care of you, that there's something fundamentally wrong with you that nobody would want to. That is a terribly painful thing. And yes, dismissing people tend to get a bad rap in the adult world. But if you really pay attention to the experience of the childhood, the profound neglect that they've experienced, and many of them, this terrible rejection over and over and over again that they experience, it's easy to find compassion, I think, for the dilemma and the strategy of shutting down the attachment experience means that you don't actively attempt to form intimate relationships, which results in a loneliness that's almost unbearable. One of the reasons why they move in that transactional way is to try and address the loneliness that comes from being disconnected from everyone. And they're not feeling, so it's very difficult for them to identify what a meaningful experience is consciously, and to enjoy that because they don't have that feeling sense. And really, it can be quite disconcerting to a dismissing person if the only way that they know what's going on with you is being able to elicit you telling them. And you get mad at them and you stop talking to them, they go into a terrible state because they're completely disconnected and completely blind to what's going on, and they don't know how to respond to that. So what is the way out of that? If you find that you're dismissing, what we suggest is that you begin by pulling the filter of the embodied emotional states out of that process of making conceptual reality. So you have the capacity to sense the object that can be sensed when there's contact, the consciousness of the sensing experience arises. It's evaluated for urgency. Does it need immediate attention? Does it not matter? Is there time for a pleasant experience? And then it's mapped onto the perceptual database. And these meaning threads are attached. And between the rolling of ultimate reality and defining meaning and creating the tableau of conceptual realities where these filters go. And if you have a filter that doesn't allow any emotional experience consciously, when you create conceptual reality, it's without emotion. And so what we, uh, uh, through the practice of meditation, pull out the filter and allow the conscious experience of emotion. Then what happens, of course, is you have the conscious experience of emotion, which you have no skills to regulate consciously because you've never really had those experiences before. So there's a kind of rough period between not feeling anything, feeling things, but not having good strategies to regulate them, and then beginning to develop the strategies to regulate them. Once you have that feeling life back and a conscious experience of it, you can really begin orienting away from an exclusive secondary pursuit of the gathering of resources into things that might be meaningful to you. And then you can begin to attend to activating the attachment system so that you can begin to form relationships. Once you have the capacity to feel consciously again, the value of having reliable regulators comes up more. And so you can begin to see why it would be useful to you as a dismissing person to have these reliable relationships. Now, remember that just because you're not consciously experiencing emotion doesn't mean that you don't need to be regulated. And one of the experiences that a dismissing person has in relationship to a preoccupied person is that the preoccupied person experiences the empathetic emotional experience of someone else as the primary experience, and they spend a lot of effort in regulating the empathetic experience of someone else. So in a relationship between a dismissing and a preoccupied person, the preoccupied person is emotionally regulating the dismissing person. And so the trade for proximity, the a preoccupied person has physical closeness, but what the dismissing person gets out of that is emotional regulation. So they really like to have that kind of relationship happening. They like the preoccupied person there. Because preoccupied people tend to be quite emotionally dysregulated, this is not a drawback for dismissing people because they don't feel it. They don't have an empathetic experience. So you could be a raving, preoccupied person, completely in tantrum mode, and it wouldn't be a problem for a dismissing person because they don't feel it. But it would be a problem for anybody else who has a capacity for empathy because the experience of your dysregulation over time would be off-putting. But once, of course, you allow the experience of emotion consciously, you can't do that piece anymore. So it's one of the challenges to renegotiating relationships. Um, you need to change your mind about the value of attachment in order to enter into an attachment relationship. But dismissing people are good at exploring, and once they understand that actually they can take bigger risks emotionally if they have somebody who regulates them well, then suddenly having a reliable relationship takes on more value. The other piece that needs to change in a dismissing person is, and this is also part of seeing the value of an attachment relationship, is an interest in someone else. This is particularly challenging for dismissing people because they never experience people being interested in them. And when their emotional life comes back on, they often experience longing for that. But in dismissing people, that longing experience is often a sadness, or if there's a lot of rejection, sadness and shame. And so it's a converting of that sadness and that shame back into a longing for somebody to be able to see them. And if they pick somebody who actually is interested in them and interested in seeing and knowing them, they begin to learn the value of that. And that opens up the possibility of a collaborative exchange where they allow themselves to express authentically who they are, and the other person is interested in that. And then they exchange that with the other person by being interested in them. In a typical dynamic between a dismissing person and someone else, the dismissing person does not provide that kind of interest or care. It's really the reason that they don't is it's unknown to them. They never think of doing that. They never think of asking you how you're doing because no one ever asked them how they were doing. They don't know the value of what that is. Nobody ever saw them, so they don't know the value of being seen. So they don't think to offer that to anyone else. And so that's part of the changing of your mind about that, to pick people that are actually interesting to you. Now, in that view of the dismissing person where they're elevated, they're the great person. And often that a point of view is, I would be totally happy to be in a reciprocal relationship with you if you were up to my standard. But since you're so clearly not up to my standard, I feel comfortable taking from you what it is I need and not reciprocating. Now, mind you, there was no reciprocation in their early experience. They simply performed what they had to in order to get the care that they wanted. And so there's a change of mind there. You have to take on the care of somebody else in order to open up the world of secure functioning, because secure people won't accept a one-sided relationship. The reason that dismissing people often end up with preoccupied people is preoccupied people will accept that. They'll provide all of the care that you need in exchange for proximity and be content with that. Until they burn out, and then they often make demands for some kind of reciprocal care. And what you'll find in the dismissing person is sometimes there's a limited amount of care that's offered until the preoccupied person is resettled. But as soon as they think it's back to normal, all of that care goes away and they're back to just receiving the care. Or they simply move on to somebody else because they don't really do that kind of Christian.
Would you describe like working with a client a long time ago that was really dismissing, that kind of had a breakthrough in terms of recognizing his own emotions, doing a lot of maybe noting feeling states practice, and that he really had a lot of umbrage for you with what resulted, the dam bursting. Um, and I'm curious if you kind of have some thoughts on like what would be an entry into the shallow end of the pool for someone that's dismissing, that's trying to explore, their own emotional range in a way that wouldn't be overwhelming.
So you heard me describe this earlier, which was you're going to have the experience of drawing into consciousness your emotional experience, and then you're going to have this difficult period of not having conscious skills to regulate your emotions. and that you're going to have to then learn the skills to regulate your emotion, which is what I learned from that particular person, where I thought that, and I don't know why I thought this, maybe just not thinking clearly, or some kind of idealized sense of emotion, but that once the emotion became conscious, that he would enjoy the experience of it since it had been absent for so long. And in the beginning, he did, but then when he got into experiencing difficult emotions and had no way of suppressing them any longer, he got quite dysregulated by that. And so now I'm just very upfront about letting people know that there's going to be a period where you're going to have uh, emotions, and the regulation of them is going to be challenging. But not for so long. You learn the skills pretty quickly that you need to regulate. Um, the noting feeling states technique is the way into that, because it's a way of bringing your attention into the body and looking for emotional sensations. Most dismissing people have the sensations in the body, but they're misidentified as physical sensations and not emotional sensations. It's not uncommon, for instance, for a dismissing person to present at the hospital with a heart attack only to be told that they're having an anxiety attack, but they don't have any emotional experience of the pain in the body. They just have the physical sensation of intense experience. So you can, of course, regulate the amount of practice that you do to slow down the experience of emotion arising consciously and identifying it in the body. And there often is a period where you're able to discern emotional sensation from not emotional sensation, but you have no further discernment than that. And so part of it is, how do you identify what the pattern of emotion is? Remember that most of us who can do that learn that in the dyadic relationship with the caregiver, right? We present something and they mirror back to us what their empathetic understanding is. And then we identify the facial expressions that they make that maps onto the emotional experience, and we begin to associate the facial expression with the body experience. And then they tell us what those emotions are. So there isn't a universal understanding of what emotions are. There's the understanding of what emotions are in your family system. So depending on how skilled your caregiver was. But for instance, in my family, my mother was not uh, clear as a modeling of emotion. So telling the difference between sadness and anger was a real challenge in the beginning, because they were so often coupled in the expressions, or fear and anger were often one expression, as my mother offered it to us. And so somebody would be sad, but I would be bracing for the anger part of the sadness, right? Not softening, but defending, because of the way that it was expressed. And took quite a while to learn a broader map of emotions. If you can't identify the emotions intuitively, and media doesn't help you do it, we often watch TV shows or movies, and they elicit a response in us, and we see on the screen the response of the actors, and they identify what the emotional experience is. Then we can learn to consciously identify them that way. But often what we're going to end up having to do is uh, ask somebody who's empathetically capable to attune to us, and then tell us what the experience of emotion they're having that is ours, so that we can begin to identify them that way. Now, remember, of course, they're not offering you a universal emotional lexicon. They're offering you the emotional map of their family system. So if you do that with several people, you'll begin to have a sense of what the emotions are. And then also you'll be engaged in this empathetic exchange with someone else, which is the best way to emotionally regulate by co-regulating with someone else. And once you get a strong taste of that, then it for dismissing people, it makes total sense that this is a much better way to do it. And so they learn quite rapidly to do it. They already have the skill set of exploration, and so they can figure these things out pretty rapidly, which is different from preoccupied people who don't explore very well and whose mentalizing is much lower typically. That making sense? So really, if you find that you're dismissing, or you find that you're in a relationship with somebody who is, the way out of that is to tune into your own emotional states and begin to uh, uh, bring that into consciousness. Because empathy is an emotional experience. If you allow yourself a conscious experience of your own emotions, you open up the possibility of a conscious experience of the empathetic uh, uh, experience of someone else, which then opens up the capacity to learn facial expressions and body language and understand, uh, gather a whole bunch more data about other people, which is the thing that opens you up to the possibility of other people. Dismissing people tend to be very cognitively oriented and very internally oriented. And because they're not empathetic, they don't see the value of collecting data about other people that isn't something that can be processed cognitively, which is the narratives usually. But if you open up your capacity for your own emotional experience, and then that opens up the capacity for an empathetic experience, then suddenly there's this whole rich source of data of other people that you can then use in your understanding of experience. That all making sense. And then beginning to see the value of attachment. And this comes from uh, the shift from secondary exploration into primary exploration, and the exchange of primary exploration with someone else and the synergy that can come from that. So using that basic formulation of a relationship, is somebody a good regulator for you? If you suddenly have an awareness of your emotions, and you find people who can regulate you, this is valuable suddenly, where it wasn't valuable if you didn't have the experience of emotion. And then in order to get them to do that for you, you have to be a good regulator for them. So there's the trade there. That begins the experience of collaboration. And then you have to take care of them in a way that's useful to them, so that they'll put the energy into the relationship with you. And then you have to see whether they'll take care of you in the way that you need. You may, for the first time, be exploring what it is that you actually need in a relationship, that you can attain through a collaborative exchange rather than a transactional exchange. Touching into the terrible sadness and being able to hold that experience allows that whole false self to just collapse, because you no longer need the defense from touching into the sadness. And then as you move into the primary exploration and you align your primary exploration with someone else, there's a synergy that forms. They go out and explore and come back, and in their expression of that to you, you learn things that are actually useful in your exploration, and you go out and explore. And when you come back and you express it to them, they learn things that are valuable to their exploration. And that synergy of each other's primary exploration is really the energy that supports these long relationships that are very beneficial. Make sense? Why don't we do a little practice? Let's do some noting feeling states technique, since that's the primary technique for opening up emotional experience So we'll do a few minutes of concentration practice and then some noting feeling states technique. So go ahead and settle into your meditation posture. Right. Let go of the meditation. So thanks for your practice. Saturday, I'm going to give an artist talk about my photography. The last exploration workshop we did around photography, where I used it as an example, it was really mainly a discussion of advanced mentalizing. I'm not going to do any of that with this particular one. I'm just going to really talk about the evolution of the work. So if that's of interest to you, come along. And it's in support of the magazine that I have started, which is called Place, which is available if you want to subscribe to it on the website. Actually, you can sign up for the workshop by subscribing, because all of the workshops on photography I'm doing, if you're a subscriber, you can come to for free. So it's our perk for subscribers. What else is coming up? Sort of the end of the year. In the new year, we'll begin our regular schedule of level ones and level twos on both the attachment side and on the addiction side. So take a look at that. Really appreciate your practice. I offer the teaching freely, but I do hope that if you're able to make a donation of any amount, you can. All of it's appreciated. It helps support me and also the work Mettagroup is doing. Thank you for your practice, and I will see you soon. Bye.